Welcome to High Infidelity, the best cheating videos on YouTube. If you enjoy this content, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications. Now let's get into the video.
Discovered my wife's, now ex, affair the day she was admitted into hospital. Now years later she can't accept my engagement to my fiancé. If there was a medal for the most horrific method to hear of your significant other's affair, I'd definitely win it and be in its Hall of Fame. Since, like so many others in this sub, I suddenly found myself a member of a club that no one ever wants to be a part of. I'll never forget the sound of my ex-sister in voice laws on the phone as she kept screaming I'm sorry over and over as I was driving home after a week-long business trip. I was perplexed and had no idea what she meant, but it wasn't until I managed to calm her down that she informed me that my wife was in the hospital and that I needed to hurry home. My mind went into overdrive as I tried to gather more information, while also avoiding a crash as I began speeding to get there faster. The only thing she said me was that it was an assault, before cutting the line and refusing to respond when I called her again. A little history: my ex and I met in our mid-20s at a BBQ thanks to a mutual acquaintance. She appeared almost too wonderful to be true at first. Not only was she stunningly attractive, but she was also timid and introverted. It took long for us to formally date, but once we did, I was overjoyed. When we first attempted to be personal, she started weeping, which should have been regarded as a warning omen. I panicked out and assumed it was my fault, but she apologized the following day and said she had been triggered. It turns out she had been in a long-term relationship with a person who was violent emotionally, physically, and psychologically 2 years before meeting me. He would belittle her during their intimate times, then apologize. She had a flashback, but told me it had nothing to do with me. So we took things slowly since she was still in treatment. It was difficult, but since I loved her, I hoped that after we got over it, it would strengthen our connection, and for a time, it looked that way. Fast forward another year, and we've been engaged. First-time intimacy also occurred at this period, and I was lucky enough to be able to purchase a home for us thanks to an inheritance from my late uncle. Things were going well, so I half-jokingly proposed that we plant a peach tree, essential later on, to symbolize fresh beginnings, and she was fine for it. We were married not long after that, and it was simply incredible. Of course, we had our typical ups and downs like any married couple, but I considered us more fortunate since she always made it a point to never go to bed angry with each other, and she would always gently point out if I did something to upset her. Later in life, I was generally promoted in my job, which meant more salary but also meant I would be traveling more for professional conferences and business meetings. I noticed she was crying a lot more and wasn't as personal as she used to be. She kept her phone near to her and even stopped gently addressing topics that affected her. I attempted to speak to her about it, but she convinced me that she was great and that this was just a phase she was going through. So I let it go. She would sometimes go to her sister's house and stay the night, telling me she simply wanted some girl time with her sister. And the day I received that fatal phone call was the day she was supposed to be keeping her sister company again. I recall racing into the hospital, hardly breathing, and desperately calling for my wife when the world's most compassionate and patient police officer sat me down to explain what had occurred. He said he was a friend of my SIL and that he occurred to attend to a domestic disturbance call and saw a couple arguing. The purported boyfriend was on top of the female, pounding her as she screamed and tried to scratch him. This made no sense to me since 1. It had nothing to do with my wife because we're married, and 2. Everyone who knew my wife knew she wouldn't do that. He gave me a knowing look and put his hand on my shoulder before telling me to be cool since said girlfriend was really my wife. I would have laughed in his face if it hadn't been for the gravity of the situation, but something about the way he stated everything made me believe him. I was then escorted in by a nurse to meet my wife, and what greeted me to this day I still can't find the words to express. I remained there for what seemed like an age until a doctor arrived and detailed her injuries to me. Her jaw was slightly, her left eye was totally swelled shut, and she had extensive bruises covering half of her face, in addition to 3 broken ribs. The doctor then delivered another bombshell by informing me that she was pregnant. I was still perplexed as to how this could have occurred until I saw her sister. She first attempted to avoid me, but after the urging of a police officer buddy, she told me what she knew. It turns out my wife's ex had contacted her 5 months earlier, and he was doing this redemption pyramid step thing where he apologized to those he had hurt in order to cleanse his karma. Anyone else BS meter going crazy right now. They started conversing more, and he persuaded her to meet up for coffee so he could show her he was a different guy. Obviously, old feelings resurfaced, and combined with the fact that he appeared changed now, it quickly developed into an emotional affair. My wife sought advice from her sister, who advised her to take things slowly and just get it out of her system if necessary, which led to a physical affair 3 months later. She genuinely urged my wife that she should at least make peace with her ex, in whatever shape that may take, and even offered to cover for my wife every now and again. My SIL was in tears at this point and started apologizing to me, claiming she had no idea about the abuse since my wife had never informed anybody about it except me and her therapist at the time. I felt numb. I couldn't feel anything, and I was completely perplexed by my wife's conduct. I was there when my wife eventually awoke, and she broke into tears upon seeing me. I spent the next several months in zombie mode, with individual therapy for her and marital counseling for us, at the intense prodding of her family. In counseling, she was surprisingly open about how it happened and how she hated herself for causing me pain. She mentioned how, on her way home from his place, she fantasized about driving into the river because she smelt like him and didn't want his scent to corrupt me. However, that made sense. She said she tried to end it but was too weak, and it wasn't until she found out she was pregnant that she woke up and realized she was pregnant. She became a shell of herself and developed a fear of all guys except me. At one point, she couldn't even go to the toilet at night unless I held her hand said right. We'd obtained a paternity test after the kid was born, boy, by the way, and he was mine, but the more time I spent with her, the more I realized I didn't dislike my wife. I detested her. I couldn't see the lady I married, but instead saw his leftovers every time I looked at her. So I chose to leave because I was worried I'd do something I'd later regret and become just like her violent ex. She asked me not to go and even offered me a hall pass, as well as smacking her if I wanted to, but I realized at this moment I had to get away. During the divorce, she was really quite giving, moving back home with her parents and signing a very well thought-out co-parenting plan approved by the courts. 3 years later, I met my now fiancé by coincidence. I was in a bookstore with a friend, talking Egyptian mythology, when this lovely lady approached me to correct my pronunciations of Egyptian gods and towns. Needless to say, I was blown away not just by her comprehension but also by the fact that she is Egyptian herself. We exchanged numbers, which led to us dating, and when I ultimately proposed to her, it was in front of the same tree I had planted years before. I went down on one knee, but before I could respond, she dashed inside the house and returned with a ring. Turns out she was planning on proposing to me because she was passionately in love with me and didn't want any other woman to have me, and my kid, in all his precious childlike innocence, informed his mother what occurred since he was there at the time. My ex physically walked up in the rain that night, ranting about how I should propose to her, my fiancé, in front of our tree, and how this isn't the end of us. I'm utterly weary at this point. I can't go and see since she's the mother of my kid, but she's bothering me and my fiancé. How can I persuade her to move on, to overcome her phobia of males, and not to force me to get a restraining order? Sorry for the lengthy response, but I'm in a terrible situation. Edit. I wanted to ask the wise ladies of Reddit a question. Something that really bothers me to this day is the fact that she made time for her ex, who took joy in ruining her, only for her to endure a far worse destiny. Is it common for the abused to seek the abuser's attention, even if she despises him? Something my ex said once. Edit 2. I forgot to include this in the initial article, but when my fiancé gave me the ring she was going to use to propose to me, it had an etching on the inner band that said, "To my Pharaoh." I adore this gal.